everyone. I guess there's an audience that is turning up at the moment. I don't know if we can be seen or not seen. This is, I presume everyone's familiar with Zoom to some extent after a year and a half of pandemic. This is the awkward bit at the beginning, as you well know. So please, if you've got any ideas for small talk, feel free to put them in the chat. The weather, I guess, is always good. It's sunny in Sydney, which is nice. Hal, how are you?
I'm great, thanks, Sacha.
Excellent. Is it sunny where you are?
Sun's just come out. Yep. So that's probably heading your way.
Nice. Because you're uphill from me, right? Is that how it works?
Yeah, I think the weather systems are coming. I don't know. I think they're coming in from the south, maybe.
Yeah, right.
Maybe.
Kate, how are you?
I'm good. I got a touch of sun on my skin today as I drove into work, and I felt like one of those sort of underground moles that had just emerged. I didn't know what was going on. It feels like it's been relentless rain in Sydney anyway.
It is a funny feeling. I felt some sun today too and was surprised by it. Clayton, how are you?
Yeah, well, I'm hoping for a bit more sun too. I'm in Sydney and I'm jack of the rain and the cold. I want a proper summer now.
Yeah, I don't think we're getting one. I'm sorry.
Yeah. It's better than drought and bushfires, isn't it?
It is. Something in the middle, in between would be good.
Just in the middle would be nice. Yeah.
That sweet spot that we used to know as summer. Look, it's 2 minutes past. I'll leave it another couple of minutes and extend this awkward small talk because I'm cool like that. But get going soon. Why don't I just do some general background talking? Let's kick it off that way. Okay, I'll kick it off with general background so we get to the real meaty, substantial stuff soon. So, of course, a really important thing is that we're meeting in many places. This is the beauty of digital technology. We're not just in one. I am on Gadigal and Bidjigal land. This land was never ceded. I want to pay my respects to the elders past and present, acknowledge them as owners of country and the holders of knowledge for this place. So welcome to this second year in media transition. This is something we've made into an annual event, and this is event number 2. Last year we had a great session with Louise Milligan, Jacqueline Maley and Troy Ramsden, all reflecting on the year in journalism. So this year we're going to do something different and talk about digital media and digital regulation. There's been a lot that's been happening, right? So this is the year that Facebook went dark, then it went meta after some explosive whistleblower revelations. This was the year Google threatened to withdraw search from Australia, to which Bing and Microsoft responded that they weren't going anywhere. And this was the year of a lot of defamation news, right? Christian Porter's case, followed by a High Court decision in Voller that left some news media scratching their heads. And around all that happening, part of those stories, it was a year where Australia's media regulators really kicked into action in a lot of ways. And so that's what we want to talk about today, whether that's heading in the right direction, whether it's improving our discourse, whether it's heading in a direction that will protect democracy and improve society, or are there instances here of significant regulatory overreach in a way that threatens free speech as well. So today we've got 3 fabulous, excellent panelists. We've got Kate Brito, who is the executive director of the Flash news streaming service. So it in itself is a demonstration of how things are changing. We'll talk about that. And she was formerly at Mamamia, where she's editor-in-chief, and news.com.au, again, where she's editor-in-chief. We've also got Hal Crawford, who's a media consultant with 25 years experience in both digital and broadcast. Until recently, he was the chief news officer at MediaWorks in New Zealand, where he ran a newsroom with 250 staff. He's also an author, and full disclosure, he is the chair of our advisory board at the Centre for Media Transition. And we also have Clayton Noble, who is the senior corporate counsel at Microsoft Australia. And I do want to mention also that Facebook and Google representatives from both of those companies were invited to come. They both thought long and hard about coming, but in the end decided not to. And I think that is also revealing. Okay, so let's dive straight into some questions. And I wanted to let everyone who's here know we're going to try to get to audience questions at the end. We're really going to try, and I think we can, but there's a lot to cover. So if you do have questions, please pop them into the Q&A, where they'll be moderated, or just sorted through, because there'll be such a torrent, no doubt. And you can use the chat for other comments, technical issues, for instance, or other comments. And we're recording today. I wanted to let you know. Alexia and Rosa behind the scenes are going to monitor the chat and Q&A. Thank you both very much. All right, so what a year, as I just briefly said. News media just keeps on reinventing itself, right? So regulators have made some moves to keep up with that. We've seen, the smartphone, the rise of the smartphone. We've seen the rise of social media. People are consuming news in different ways. And Kate, you're really engaged in that space, working with Flash as the executive director of Flash, which is a news streaming service. So, one point that a lot of people raise is that distinction between the way traditional news media is regulated, and quite heavily regulated, and the way that digital platforms are not. Is that something that you encounter in your work and as you're working on Flash?
Well, it's definitely something that we've encountered over, recent years as we've seen the rise of, big tech, whether you want to call them a media company, they don't like to call themselves that, but, I would think they are. And if you consider, the laws or standards or regulations or even public expectations that govern traditional media, and then ask yourself, what of those apply to big tech media, I think mostly the answer is not very many. Mostly, the things that are going on in big media are still quite not transparent. And I just think how you regulate that is probably a very difficult question. But as a society, are we happy to have big businesses who don't seem to have the same regulations that exist around traditional media? And I think my answer would be that they do need some sort of regulation. I guess, we would hope that people can, or businesses can be self-regulating, but, we only have to look at the whistleblowing that came out of Facebook, this year to see that big businesses don't always do the right things. They do need some oversight.
And as a news streaming service, are you finding that you're basically bound by all the regulation legislation that binds, the Daily Telegraph or the Australian, or are you sort of in a bit of a grey area?
Well, we run broadcast content, so we're sort of covered by regulations that operate around broadcast. The easiest way to think about us is just the way you would think about any other streaming service, Netflix or Binge or Disney, but we're just for news. So we're not a website, we're not a news aggregator. We have 25 different news partners and their content appears on our platform. So they have to the same content they're putting onto their own platforms. It has to live up to the same standards when it appears on Flash.
Okay. Well, Clayton, I imagine you have some thoughts on this as well. So you're at Microsoft. What's your perspective on that general issue of the difference in regulation of digital media versus traditional?
Yeah, look, it certainly has been quite different from traditional media, and I understand the perspective of particularly the broadcast media, who have been heavily regulated for a long time, in regulations that are built up over a long time. But I would say that things are moving fast in the spaces that we operated in at Microsoft. We've got a diverse range of different services. So it's we cover quite a few different areas. And, if you look at just the last few years, we've had abhorrent violent material law came in right after the Christchurch incident. There's a swag of online safety legislation and codes under that coming through, which are big for us. Encryption legislation, critical infrastructure legislation, lots of stuff going on around security. We're very much involved in defamation law. We're regularly in the courts for our search engine, being sued for defamation, and so we're participating in the defamation law review being conducted by the state and territory AGs at the moment. And then just recently we saw the new social media anti-trolling bill coming out of the federal government, which is really a defamation law, not a trolling law. And so we're looking at that and its impact on our services. privacy, online privacy bill is out there at the moment. The News Media Bargaining Code, which you alluded to earlier, Sacha. Yep, a lot of things going on in the space, and competition law reviews, ACCC going through cycles. So we're kept busy, but I appreciate what you say, Kate, because it has been a lot more free in lots of digital spaces than it has been for traditional media for a long time. And I think it's taking a while for regulation to catch up. But certainly in Australia and in other parts of the world, the catch up is coming.
Yeah, and here in Australia, we're leading the way with a lot of these. News Media Bargaining Code, I guess most famously. This is a very big question that you may choose not to answer, Clayton, but how do you score the government? How do you score the regulator? There's so much happening. If you kind of view it in totality, clearly the government is trying to do many different things, but do you think it's doing a pretty good job?
Look, I do overall. I mean, they're moving in areas that need regulatory action. And from our perspective, it's important that government catch up here because there are a lot of trust issues with online businesses, with digital businesses. As to whether they're getting it right, I think we're moving fast. And I work for a corporation with lots of money, right? That has the resources to engage with government and give feedback on these proposals that are coming out. My concern is that we need to move fast, but not faster than the speed of thought, right? We need to move fast, but be aware of unintended regulatory consequences. And I think the tech industry is catching up. The Tech Council of Australia is now up and running. It's a very recent organisation, but it's representing some businesses like ours who've been able to participate in those processes for a long time, but a lot of the smaller and big now Australian tech businesses, digital businesses, and is getting in there to help ensure that government is aware of, when new laws come in with these scopes, what are the businesses that will be caught, and some of them maybe should be and aren't being caught, and some of them are being caught with unintended consequence there. So it's a lot of work, but it's a worthwhile process. And I think the government is doing the right thing by regulating here, because it shouldn't be left to unaccountable. We are accountable to a certain extent, but undemocratic businesses to make big societal decisions. The services that we offer in Google and Facebook can have big societal impacts, and so it's appropriate that our democratic institutions are the ones that lead with the rules for Australians in Australia in that space.
I think that's such a good point, Clayton, and I agree, because I think that however hard it might be to create some sort of regulations, I wonder, is that an excuse not for us to pursue it as an ideal? Because is it harder to employ those regulations and regulate that information those companies promote, or is it harder for our societies to deal with the issues that are arising as a result of some of those problems? And as we can see, they are quite complex. We talk about, teenage girls, and, the issues are vast. They go beyond, violent images on YouTube. And so I think that those societal issues are so, in some ways, hard to measure, but their impacts are enormous. And I guess that's what we need to weigh up, isn't it? The benefits of the free information versus, the potential damage that's being caused within our societies.
Absolutely important stuff.
Indeed.
If I could just go on, Clayton. So Brad Smith, who's the President and Chief Legal Officer, my boss at Microsoft, has spoken about the concept of minimum viable regulation. In the tech industry, we talk about minimum viable products, not creating the product that can do everything perfectly, but testing and improving. And I think the regulatory system, if we can keep improving and testing with incremental changes to solve problems one by one, we don't have to have a great big act that solves everything. And I feel like the Australian government is trying to do that, to add new dimensions to the regulatory rubric or framework to solve problems one by one and keep it consistent, but also improve as we go over time.
And I know we're going to move on, and we're not letting Hal have a word, but I think the other thing is that's right too. And you obviously know you're at the pointy end of those sort of issues. But I would say that if you create a really rigid framework of regulations, if people aren't joining that in the right spirit, big companies like Google, for example, will find ways out of it, and will find new ways of operating that then escape those certain regulations. And then it becomes like whack-a-mole, doesn't it? You're kind of creating something here to stop them doing this. And, you know, they have vast resources and a vast ability to change their operating system so that perhaps those regulations or rules are meaningless, you know, within a matter of months. That's, yeah. So I agree, Clayton.
Yeah, look, these are really tricky issues and they're interconnected. And one of my frustrations, in a sense, is that there isn't often more of a holistic view taken. But of course, that's really difficult. But of course, I do want to come to Hal. Now, Hal, I'm going to get to specific issues, and some of these have already been touched on. But I wanted to give you a chance to respond to any of those issues that were raised there, including that idea of traditional media versus the new media and the difference in regulation.
Yeah, I mean, some great points made there. And I think Kate's point there that the spirit with which the companies come to the regulation is actually totally key here. And we've kind of seen that with the News Media Bargaining Code. So to jump ahead here a bit, because the News Media Bargaining Code was kind of a real strong arm tactic and has been used as a threat rather than actual legislation, I think that you'll find that both Google and Facebook have been forced into this situation. And then, of course, they're doing deals where they have to politically, and where they don't have to politically, they're not doing them. And that's kind of like, well, what do you expect? Of course, that's the case because they never wanted to do this thing in the first place. So the intention is important, and bringing everyone along for the ride is important. And I'm sure we'll have a lot of controversy around that later in the discussion. But just on to what extent should digital platforms be responsible for the content that sits on those platforms? Well, you know, Kate pointed out that there should be some level of responsibility there, but I would just make a point that to go all the way to traditional publisher level responsibility for that content is not really compatible with the existence of those platforms. So I'm there. I'm very much, there has to be another level of responsibility. And in particular, my point is that those platforms are unprecedented in their power. And therefore we have to develop a new approach. And they really have to contribute more to the societies where they're deriving their revenue and their profits. So how you do that, well, that's the big question.
There's certainly some research now and some theorists who are arguing about we don't just need to regulate, say, algorithms, but we need to regulate and oversee them in a way that doesn't just limit what they do, but promotes the positive outcomes that we want, you know, that sort of thing that you're talking about, Hal. Look, there are so many issues to unpack here, but let me take you back to, you mentioned the News Media Bargaining Code. Let's just focus on that for a moment. So what a remarkable year of the development from April 2020 to February 2021, where the law was passed. It was a remarkable period where we saw Google for 6 months wage a really hardcore PR campaign against it, threatened to remove its search engine. We saw Facebook ultimately in the final week of negotiations go dark, remove news from its platform. And in the end, we saw this very much amended piece of legislation that was passed, but that isn't in effect or that sits in the background as long as digital platforms, specifically Facebook and Google, make deals with news media businesses. Now, deals have been made. News Corp admitted recently that their deal was in the 6 figures. So, you know, we know that we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars that have flowed from Facebook and Google to news media businesses. So this is a big bunch of issues just wrapped up in this News Media Bargaining Code. But Hal, you sound pretty negative about it.
Yeah, look, I don't have any problem with the platforms paying money for, you know, to contribute more fully to the societies in which they operate. And then my preferred approach would be that goes into consolidated revenue and is then distributed, you know, along the normal lines by the government. What we have at the moment is a bit of a dark and shadowy situation where these deals are, no one knows what the content is. No one knows where the money's being spent and if in fact it's being spent on public interest journalism. I mean, one thing I would say though, I mean, I have been pretty consistently negative about this legislation, mostly because I think the process is wrong and corrupt. But one thing that I would say is that there are pretty clear signs that there's been some positive effects from this. And so, you know, let's look at the evidence. And some of the evidence, again, the data is pretty thin on the ground, but, you know, we've seen some journalist jobs advertised, and there's a bit of an uptick there. So that's great. However, you know, the process is so flawed that I don't think, you know, and then you have the conversation and SBS, they're complaining because they're left out. And, you know, when you've got a process this kind of rough, none of that surprises me. And I would, you know, a really interesting thing for us here in Australia is to know that the whole world is looking at this, and there are several jurisdictions who are wanting their own version of our code. And I'm telling those people, don't do it. On the other hand,
don't you think, Hal, that it just still having set that global precedent is important? You know, I think obviously the motivation was that strong arm to make big tech pay for the content that they effectively, you know, purloin and make money from. But at the same time, I think it's good to not just look at it through a local lens and to see it as correcting an imbalanced relationship. You may be very right, in a flawed manner and in a way that maybe we can move forward to. But the fact that it does have that sort of global precedent, I think is really important.
I think it's absolutely fascinating. And I think the precedent that it sets that is important is that you can force global platforms to do stuff. And that's the important one. And because I don't agree with your statement that you know, it's about purloined content, because I don't see it that way. I don't think that that's an accurate representation of what happens. Or if it is, you know, there's a bigger problem because everyone's content is purloined effectively, not just the news media's. But yeah, look, as a precedent that you can make these incredibly powerful and multinational platforms do stuff, that's, to me, that's the big one. And it's like, well, okay, Australia's kind of got this reputation as having done a crazy bully boy thing. And, you know, that's interesting to me. More interesting, and skipping here just to the anti-trolling, and I'm sorry, Sacha, I'm totally wrecking your agenda, but I would say this is a great compare and contrast. You know, you've got the News Media Bargaining Code, never been used, on the shelf there, you know, as the kind of the nuclear option, and then all these weird deals are done. And then on the other hand, you've got this anti-trolling law, which, you know, I read it, it's only 23 pages, and to me it sounds really good. Now, you know, I'm all for this anti-trolling law, which actually shouldn't be called an anti-trolling law. It should be called some part of defamation, you know, restructuring. But, you know, so I'm definitely not against these kinds of regulations where they're done in a way that I think is consistent and right.
Thanks, Hal. Let's tackle both those issues. But Clayton, I do want to give you the chance to talk to the News Media Bargaining Code, because Microsoft, of course, when things got heated between the government and Google and Facebook, Microsoft put up its hand and said, look, we'd be quite willing to operate under this code and to have some money flow to news media from us, and also to have some other obligations. So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, look, I think, you know, Hal, your point might be right that you know, from a copyright law perspective, search engines and social media were not infringing copyright of the news media that were producing the content. But on a bigger level, I think the real issue was advertising money, the revenue was moving from media agencies that produce news journalism, that fund the important societal role that news journalism fulfills for democracy, for accountability and all those things, to platforms that do not create. Don't pay the salaries of journalists to go and hold our politicians to account. And so we had a societal problem. And this is one way to look at, well, we need to get the money from there to there. And I think it's a totally valid way to cross-subsidize, if you want, to ensure that we have journalists out there holding our government to account. So I think we can get too lost in the minutiae of the issue, and taking a step up and looking at it from a higher level realizes we've got a problem to solve, and this is a way to solve it. Of course, Microsoft said if Google pulls out, we'll be here and we'll pay the news media. All opportunity for us. If you've read the ACCC's report, Bing search is about 4% of searches in Australia at the moment, and Google's 95 point something. So we had great opportunity there. But also we believe in a long-term view that funding journalism makes sense because it's needed for the democratic societies we live in. And on the online trolling issue, I think there is some good stuff in there. And one thing, for example, that's we're starting to see is a requirement to have social media platforms of a certain scale have a subsidiary in market or an appointed agent in market that's within jurisdiction. For the lawyers, this is important if appointed part of local law accountability. At Microsoft, we've long taken the view that regardless of which entity in our international system of companies is providing the service, we will obey the laws and participate in the court processes in the countries in which we operate, regardless of the service being offered from a US corporation outside of Australia, and that's an important part of accountability.
Given you've raised that as well as Hal, so this was an announcement by the Prime Minister on November 28, these anti-troll laws, which Hal says shouldn't be called that. And the quote was, "We cannot allow social media platforms to provide a shield for anonymous trolls to destroy reputations and lives." And so this initiative has two elements. And the first one is that social media platforms will be required to establish a quick, simple, standardized complaint system that ensures defamatory remarks can be removed and trolls identified with their consent. And second, a new federal court order will be established that requires social media giants to disclose identifying details of trolls to victims without consent, which will then enable a defamation case to be lodged. So, Clayton, your take on that generally is that this is a move in the right direction?
I think we'll wait and see the impact. I'm not sure it's going to have all the impact that the government seeks, but I mean, I think it's best if I tell you about my experience working as a lawyer for Microsoft. We have LinkedIn as a social media service. We don't have so much of a problem with these defamation issues with LinkedIn because people tend to have their own identity on LinkedIn. It's the place where you put your resume and you engage in professional networking. So there's not much anonymity. There's no anonymity there. The issue we have had, and we're pretty good at stopping, is fake profiles. So if I set up a profile for, Kate Brito and start defaming people and so on. But we're pretty good at establishing those fake profiles, red flagging them and getting rid of them. And we get a few flags on that platform for defamatory complaints about content, and we're able to deal with those pretty smartly. We do get a lot of defamation litigation in Australia because of our search engine. And if we're getting a lot with our 4% share, I'm sure Google is getting a lot more. And one of the things we're looking at there is, there's a big argument about are search engines publishers or not, and trying to fit into that old paradigm of defamation laws that were founded in the days of published newspapers and adapted to broadcasting over time and so on. Let's look at what's going to be effective in removing the harms of defamation to reputation, but also facilitate the appropriate level of freedom of expression. Search engines are a way that people find the content on the web. And the way the law is working currently, we are responsible for the third-party sites that we link to through our search engine. And if we link to a Sydney Morning Herald article about Eddie Obeid, and we get a takedown notice from Eddie Obeid, claiming that it's defamatory of him, unlike the Sydney Morning Herald, we can't access the journalist to establish whether there are defences of truth, public interest, all the various qualified privilege, the various defences that traditional media with editorial control have. So I think we need to look at a better and yet also there are some pretty bad websites out there that are defaming people maliciously. And so to take those down on request, it seems reasonable. But the problem for us is we don't have access to the information behind the content. So I think better processes can be instituted so that we're doing a lot more to take down links from our search for the defamatory content should be taken down. And ultimately, it's best if that's determined by a court. And yet we're not facilitating in Australia some European-style right to be forgotten, because we do it. I'm sure Google do too. We do get notices from people requesting takedown of very respectable investigative journalist articles published in mainstream press, because people want to clear their name by having them removed from search. And I don't think that's the best outcome here.
Do you ever do that?
It's always a balancing act. It's difficult. We have a very less than ideal system of determining which links we'll take down. And the ones in the middle are hard. When it's mainstream media, we don't take them down, no. When it's some of the malicious, your reputation killing sites, it's much easier to do so. The in-between ones are hard.
Yep, a lot of hard in-between cases here. Okay, so this online trolling proposed law, which we haven't seen yet, follows on from the High Court decision in Bola from a few months back, September, in which the High Court ruled that news media companies are liable for third-party comments left beneath their story. So even if they don't know about these comments. Kate, I imagine this is something that you have an opinion on as someone in the news media.
I do. I think it's the most extraordinary thing about that at the time, and I believe this has been rectified, is that if you put up a story as a publisher, you weren't enabled to stop comments. You were only either put it on or don't put it up on Facebook, on or off. And to me, you can't make a law making a publisher liable for comments on Facebook without giving them the power to determine how to manage comments. Yes, they could have someone sitting there, which was what you had to do. So if you thought there was potential for, for comments to be defamatory, as you can always, there can be alarm bells because people can be horrible. So you might have a story about, let me be frank, it might be a story about an Indigenous person. They might be a sports star. They might be a hero, but there will always be people make racist comments. That would be an example. The only thing you can do is have someone sitting there watching those comments. They go up and they're pulled down. They go up and they're pulled down. That's a ridiculous and absurd process to my mind as a publisher. So I believe that that's been addressed now, that Facebook has now given some more control for publishers around comments. But to make that decision that you can be responsible just from a technical point of view for something over which you have no control, and to not make Facebook responsible seemed to me to be just a bizarre understanding of how the process works. So that probably doesn't get into the legality, more into the technicalities, but that was sort of where we first landed.
Yeah, well, I guess the law regulators are very much struggling to get on top of this, and hence the new bill. And you're thinking here about the person who makes the racist post, the racist comment. You're thinking about the news media outlet that's written the story where that comment appears, and you're thinking about, say, Facebook in this case. And I guess the tricky issue is ethically and legally, where does the responsibility lie? And this is not easy. Hal, did you have any thoughts on Vola specifically and defamation generally?
Yeah. I mean, I did not like the Vola decision. It's a decision of the High Court. The court was split. The two younger members of the court did not agree with the majority. I just thought it not quite bringing the court into disrepute. That's exaggerating, but honestly, to as Kate points out, to make this decision in a case where publishers were not even able to deactivate comments left by entirely third parties, and then the publishers are sued for defamation. Facebook wasn't sued for defamation, so we're not testing that part of the law, and neither were the people who made the actual comments. So I would point out in the Voller case that whether the comments are actually defamatory has not been determined yet. So, however, it was determined by the High Court that the publishers were the publishers of the third-party comments, which defies any kind of common sense. What has happened with the anti-trolling law, and why I say it's not really a good name for it, the most important thing in there for me is the complete reversal of that silly situation. So now, this law hasn't passed, of course, but if and when it does, the publishers will not be responsible for those third-party comments, and the onus will be on the platforms to defend themselves in the case of defamation. So it completely swings the situation. There are a lot of defences available for the platforms, such like, they've got a good takedown process and so forth. But to me, this is good common sense legislation.
Thanks, Hal. Well, there's so much to cover. I want to move on. I mentioned Frances Horgan, the Facebook whistleblower, earlier. So she came out, obviously, remarkable 37-year-old woman who had a strategy when she realised that what the company was doing was, in her eyes, deeply unethical. And she thought, I've got to get this out into the world because the company is not going to address this internally. So, these revelations, these documents that she shared showed that Facebook knew that Facebook was harming a lot of teen girls, Instagram. It knew that its site was enabling human trafficking and drug cartels. It knew that it was helping the promotion of vaccine misinformation, hate speech. And I've heard her say that she knows or estimates that thousands of people were dying as a result of these policies inside Facebook, which were putting profits ahead of people, right, maximising profits. So I say that really all as background. We don't know really what's going on in a lot of these big companies, right? So, whether we're talking Facebook or Google or Microsoft, do we need, is this the real only option we have at the moment, that we need more whistleblowers? And as a supplementary question, is this something that regulators need to do, even though they're clearly afraid to force a bit more transparency out of digital platforms into revealing how their algorithms work, what sort of content they promote, and so on? Clayton, I'll start with you.
Look, I think all businesses work on a certain level of secrecy, right? That's the way businesses have operated for a long time. It's not to say that all secrets should be kept. There are good business reasons and economic reasons for allowing businesses to maintain some things secret, particularly in competitive environments, right? But certainly disclosure serves an important social benefit. And so, and whistleblowers serve an important role. And I think particularly, I'm not going to speak about the Facebook and Frances Horgan situation specifically, but whistleblowing seems to become particularly important when companies are not living their statements. If you have if you put yourself out to the world as having certain vision, ethics, all these things that companies deal with these days as a top level guiding star, it's important that that's dealt with primarily internally, but sometimes it can't be dealt with internally. And so we have these issues. What was the other part of your question? Sorry.
Well, I guess the essence of it is, do you think companies such as yours should be under some sort of mandatory transparency obligations that are, there isn't much at the moment, right? So should there be some sort of requirement?
Companies are required to disclose various things. I mean, it's a matter of what, yes. So the answer is yes, as long as the disclosures are, the right thing. And the other thing you asked about is, which is an important one, I know, for the news media, about transparency of artificial intelligence, particularly machine learning, because I know a lot of media businesses depend on search, for example, and rankings are important, and rankings in social media too, for getting their product out there in front of eyeballs, and therefore their advertising and so on. I'd say yes, it's important that businesses that have that kind of impact have some degree of transparency to the various stakeholders, including people that depend on them, particularly with such market power, because there is one search engine that is relied upon for so much of being found on the internet, for example. It is important that changes that are made on deliberate levels by those businesses, including my business in some cases, are published to the world so that there's an explanation and it's transparent. There's a big area in technology at the moment about transparency and artificial intelligence, particularly machine learning. It's not as simple as publishing an algorithm. On a technical level, machine learning is very different from programmed computing, where you can follow a logic and understand the way it works. It's all about learning by experience, and algorithms change all the time. So in search, after Michael Jackson died, the search for Billie Jean would have changed from Billie Jean King tennis player, for example, to Billie Jean the Michael Jackson song being much more highly ranked. And that is not because of any change of policy or decision by the search engine operator. This is because what people are clicking on changes because of news events, the world around us, their location as well. So it's very complex, but that is not to absolve us from responsibility for explaining and communicating what our machine learning and artificial intelligence products do, what they do well, where they're not so effective in various circumstances, and allow that information to be available to all stakeholders.
That's a very good point. And of course, transparency can be used as a way to obfuscate. If you give over everything that just buries people in data that is largely meaningless, that's not much help at all. But you mentioned the idea of explaining meaningfully. That to me is a key phrase. Hal, where do you stand on this?
Look, I think that just speaking to the Francis Horgan leaks, I think that, look, there's significant problems there that were. I'm a bit split on what she revealed. To some extent, I think she revealed the internal and ugly workings inside the sausage factory of a big company that deals with a whole bunch of the world's problems, and to some extent, that was cherry picked to make it look as bad as possible by the Wall Street Journal and by her. But I do think there are significant problems. And I think at the heart of those problems is the fact that Facebook is incentivized to maximize engagement. And that is its whole business model. So, you have this situation where if you want them to move away from maximizing engagement at every opportunity, which, as we know now, also includes boosting stuff that's untrue and stuff that divides and harms communities. If we want that network, that platform to move away from that, we've got to make that realistic. So you can't just put a bunch of rules in, for example, and think, okay, that you're going to fix that, because the organization is still going to be incentivized to maximize engagement. And that's the basis of the advertising driven model. In fact, that's what all advertising driven media have done forever, which is we'll try to maximize engagement, within certain constraints. I think that search is a different kettle of fish, really, in that case. And it's sort of, how we're going to deal with search and how we're going to deal with social media, that's going to be different. And algorithms, again, are different. And there's the issue of advance warning of algorithm changes for publishers, which is something I really believe in. If it's practical, if you can do it. But to me, we've got to look at the incentivization, that core incentivization of social networks that are driven by advertising to maximize engagement, because that's where all of the harm is coming from. Well, most of it.
And there is being work done there, of course. The OCC's AdTech inquiry and some movements in the States as well. Kate, I do want to give you the chance to talk to this issue, and I thought I'd throw in something extra. Regulators are struggling in part because things are changing so quickly. So just last week, Twitter changed its policy on posted images, and it's confusing. I'm seeing a lot of talk about how confusing it is. So images taken without consent can be taken down, but what does that mean? Meanwhile, Facebook recently banned facial recognition tech after for years going really, racing into that space. So things keep changing. This is a challenge for regulators, but it almost feels to me like these companies are struggling to work out the right way to behave, like they're learning ethics on the run. So I think there's a question wrapped up in there somewhere.
Well, no, going back to the last sort of part, but into what you're saying is that I think it has been a case for so long of the emperor's, new clothes with big tech. They changed our lives. They provided this incredible products, or these incredible suite of products that were free, that just turned everything. They were so helpful, so useful. There was such a sense in society for so long of that these were the good guys, that they could do no wrong, that they were just there to make our lives better, and they did. But then, of course, as happens with anything, they discovered that we all started to discover that problems, were inherent in that sort of that global reach and in that power. And I think society has just started to catch up with that. And when society does, I think that is what sort of puts the pressure on these businesses to behave correctly. And I think for a long time, only till recently, I think, did society start to also look at those big companies as potentially having problems from within. But I guess what I also wanted to say is it is moving fast. These guys were always at the forefront, and all of the politicians had no idea what was going on. What they don't understand anything about tech. As Clayton, said earlier, we're catching up. The regulators are getting smarter. They're understanding it better. But it's like, opening the lid of a sports car and expecting, me to know what any of that sort of stuff done. I'd be like, I don't know. Oh, it looks nice, but like, what does it do? I don't think the regulators understood what anything did. They didn't. And so maybe that's the transparency we're looking for, an understanding of how things work, and an ability, for our governments to fund that sort of understanding within their own cohort so that they can keep up. Because as you say, they are changing so quickly, and they are also now in a state where they're, I guess what I guess I'm trying to say is they were the leading edge, and there must be a lot of pressure to stay, because there's always something behind you, isn't there, to take over and compete with you. So I think now their innovations, they're probably chucking them up all of the time. They say, let's do reels, let's create some other way of making money or attracting audience. They don't know what the response from their audience will be. They don't know what damage or potential problems that will create. And I think that they are, by their nature, groups that, fly by the seat of their pants. They probably should be. They're creators and innovators, but with that does come a lot of risk for them. And I think as we're increasingly understanding as a society for us, and that's what I think they need to be held to account about.
Thanks, Kate. Look, we're fast running out of time, and I'm going to give a little bit of time to the audience. Sorry, there's not more, but I'll ask one last question, which has two parts, and those two parts are connected by the word trust. So, without going into all the details, mindful of the time, do you think antitrust law is the way to go here? And, we're seeing some moves to break up Google, break up some of the big players, and also the issue of trust. To me, it underpins a lot of what we're talking about, this social trust, and can we trust these platforms? And how does that to me connects a lot of what we're talking about. And I know, Hal, I might start with you because I know you've got thoughts on both of those issues.
Yeah. Well, breaking up companies sounds good. Maybe it sounds good to some people, but I think we're careful what you wish for, because at the moment, what we have is a very centralised governing bodies of these global world-spanning companies. And if we broke them up, or if their business models were completely destroyed, they might, I've just recently been getting quite interested in distributed company structures and you know, crypto uses of you know, basically networks of people that have no central organizing body. And for example, a social network that operated on those principles would be completely ungovernable, and we wouldn't be able to regulate it at all. So, you know, it is actually, let's just be thankful for what we've got. We've got Mark Zuckerberg there, and if we find out the way to regulate Facebook in a way that is good for everyone, we can do it. And that option may not always be open. In terms of trust, I think we've got to be realistic about this. And for as long as I can remember, and it's quite a long time now because I started in papers in the 90s, journos have ranked right down the bottom of trust. And I think that's just a sort of a function of what journalists and news media do. You know, it's often not very pleasant, and you're often holding people to account, and you are often making yourself a real pest and an annoyance. And on the other hand, look at the professions that are trusted, you know, doctors, nurses, and teachers, and they're always helping people. In my experience of these two groups of people, do I think that doctors and teachers and nurses are inherently better people than journalists? No way. I mean, you know, you just couldn't make that claim. So I say, let's just not worry too much about trust. I think something that was really interesting was the way that trust in media rose during the first part of the coronavirus epidemic. And, you know, that was really interesting to see that the way that the media functions, and as it comes to become more of a public service, then trust rises. And as soon as we've sort of gone back into more normal mode, it's dipped again. So to me, that's just an interesting observation. Should we aim to be hugely trusted? No way. I don't think we'd be doing our job.
Thanks, Hal. Clayton, how about you? Antitrust and trust.
Sure. So yeah, I worked for a company that was nearly split up 20 years ago through the 90s, you know, and it's interesting to look at that as a case study of the way an organization grows over time. So, you know, there was strong push for growth through Microsoft through the 90s, and it was, you know, I wasn't there at the time, but very heady times and constant growth, and not only stock price, but the spread of the software around the world and the greater use of the software that was being created by Microsoft was quite intoxicating, and that led to lots of overreach. And it takes a while, I think, for a business to realize that society's expectations change when you're not a little startup that's challenging the world and suddenly become the dominant, in an antitrust sense, in a competitional sense, and also in a social sense, the dominant product. You know, the law's expectations change on you because you become subject to different competition laws, and society's expectations change. And I think that's particularly so with things like social media, because they have not just economic impacts, but political, social, and broad impacts that we've all spoken about here. So I think we're going to see a change over time as the impact of competition law litigation and threats to the existence of the company, core threats, do have an impact. When I started at Microsoft, it was the late noughties, and it was a very different company by the time I started. Everyone was incredibly careful, and still is, but in a way that was stultifying about competition with Windows and with Office, which were dominant products then. You know, it was interesting to come into a business where the lawyers, nobody would touch anything without getting a say-so from the lawyer in those days, you know. And so it did have an impact, even though Microsoft was not split up. So there's that. And in terms of trust, I think from the business perspective that I see, trust is very important for technology. And, you know, long-term sustainability of a technology business requires a high degree of trust, because people won't use, in the end, products that they don't trust. And so we'll see over time the way that different products and different businesses change because of trust factors. But I think if you've got a long-term perspective, trust is very important.
Yeah,
and it's hard-earned and easily lost, right?
Absolutely.
In every field of life.
I think a lot of people and researchers are recognizing the importance of trust, but that doesn't mean the answers are easy. I think, our society prospers if we build trust. How do we do that? Okay, so Kate, I'd love to give you a chance to respond to those two. So please do if you have any thoughts about antitrust or trust. But there's also a question.
Look,
I'll throw in one more though, so you can choose from these because it's an audience question. Chrysanthi asks about the News Media Bargaining Code and the fact that it's essentially on the shelf. But Chrysanthi says that when she talks to people, it seems people think it's enacted rather than just on the shelf. And in effect, does the fact the public seems to think that news media are more protected than they actually are? Do you notice this as well, and does this matter?
Look, I don't know if it does matter. I mean, I think we've gone over the fact that potentially it could work better. It obviously, as you say, is on the shelf, but it depends how you look at it. Like, as I said, some publishers have definitely done well out of it. It was certainly a bargaining tool that has created that precedent we've talked about. I think for those reasons, it's been successful in my mind. Does it matter that people think it's been more successful than it has in a different way? Maybe it's not. No one's ever asked me about it. So, I mean, I know this is a concentrated group, but I've got to say, no one's ever come up to me and say, hey, Kate, you're a member of the media. Great thing, that bargaining code. I think it goes over the head of most ordinary Australians, to be honest. And to be fair, I also thought when the media were pushing for this, that it was a hard task to try to get the public on board with it, because I think a lot of them, they don't necessarily care. It's very hard to make people care about media businesses and their profitability or their inability to hire journalists or run newsrooms. They kind of, as you say, there's those complex issues, and I guess that brings us to this trust issue. People rely on news media. They probably aren't aware how much they rely on it, because it is just something that exists in so many different forms now, that I think they take it for granted. And that's, I wish, when it comes to trust, Facebook and social media have enabled the spread of news media, of traditional and trusted news media, but at the same time they've created so many problems for it financially that they've led to its sort of its erosion as well. It's a very difficult time for traditional media companies. What I'd like to see is those companies working better together. I think they've never probably been more fractured than they are, and maybe that's a result of a sort of a narrowing market for them. But I think that they need to, in some ways, stand together on these issues around other big media, and also around promoting the fact that they are trusted media. You might like one brand over another. You might support a media company that has one view and another that has another. But I think in the end, they're all there for the same reason. They are there to hold people, companies, businesses, governments to account, to bring people news of what's going on that's true, that's not fake news, that's not made up. And I think that that's the sort of thing that we need to sort of get. I'd love to see them, rallying together a bit more to support traditional media being enabled in new ways. And I guess, that's what we're trying to do with Flash.
Yeah, right. Look, the latest Roy Morgan research quarterly update on trust found that media are the fourth worst industry, so they score pretty badly, and that's not inconsistent with previous findings. But that was excluding social media. So social media were the second worst. Only banks were worse, just as a bit of context. Okay, very last question from the audience. I know that you panelists have commitments, of course, and have to go, but if you have time for one last question from Suzanne. The number of complaints generated by digital platforms is huge. Most complaints handling on digital platforms is now automated, using a range of tech tools to minimise human involvement. What do you think, and I'll go to you, Clayton, with this, what do you think of the automation of complaints handling? Are humans still necessary to resolve issues and provide redress? Should the government employ more humans to deal with the issues generated by digital platforms, or should industry help fund more humans to investigate and provide redress for harms and wrongs? Some big questions wrapped up in there.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something we're always struggling to get right. So if you, and particularly when we've got new regulations coming in, as I said at the top of this discussion, really fast for our industry. So if you just look at the online safety law that's come in, and we're now developing codes, a lot of these things, with businesses at scale, with a high volume of user-generated content coming through, it requires a lot of operational work. And we've got lots of very smart tech people, brilliant AI minds and coders that we can draw upon to try to come up with our solutions to implement the rules that we're coming under with online safety, new online safety laws, for example. But the extent to which we use technology and people, it's never either or, it's always a mix. People get things wrong too. If you look at the processes to have the farms of content moderators, it's never perfect either. It's just hard. And we're continually improving by learning and doing, rather than always getting it right the first time. That's all I'll say on that.
All right, look, we do have to leave it there. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to everyone for attending. I do want to leave you each the opportunity to add anything or to make a final comment about these large issues that we're talking about. Maybe you just want to give government and regulators a score out of 10 for their performance in 2021. It was challenging, right? But Hal, do you have a final thought?
Yeah, look, such an interesting discussion and some really great points and things for me to think about. Misinformation, one real problem about just base level comment here, misinformation, you've always got to be wary of who's determining the truth. And that, it's just something that is kind of, I have a bit of an allergic reaction to, because, everyone, when they talk about it, they always assume that we all have a consensus view of what is disinformation, but we don't. Anyway, thanks for the great conversation.
Thanks, Hal. That's a very important point. Clayton, last word, and then Kate, last word.
I think it's a great time to be working in this area. There's so much happening, and it matters, and we're doing our best, and we are improving. That's what I'll say.
Thank you. Kate?
Well, thank you for having me. I don't really have anything. I don't think I could rate the regulators. I don't know enough about what they do to determine whether they've done it properly. But I guess my hope would be that we could just, that there could be an attempt, I hope, by some of the big companies to sort of to behave more properly, to be better people, to be better individual people within big companies would be good.
Right, thank you. Nice note to finish on. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Clayton. Thanks, Hal. Thank you very much for being part of this second annual year in media transition. Thanks, Alexia and Rosa, for doing all the hard work behind the scenes, setting it all up. And thanks to everyone for coming very much. And we'll see you same place next year. See you later.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.